Live from New Delhi, you're watching DD India Global. We'll get you top stories from India and the region. I'm Tanvi Taneja. And for news from the rest of the world, I'm joined by my colleague in Washington, D.C., Nick Harper. Hello, Nick.
Good morning, Tanvi. It's 9 a.m. here in Washington, D.C. It's rather wet and misty this morning. Coming up in the next 30 minutes, Nikki Haley is expected to suspend her bid for the White House. We're live with our correspondent, and we'll have the latest on the Israel-Hamas ceasefire efforts. But first, the headlines.
India's External Affairs Minister Dr. S. Jaishankar calls for expanding cooperation in critical technologies for a safe and secure Indo-Pacific at the 10th India-Korea Joint Commission meeting in Seoul. Republican Nikki Haley to end her White House bid, clearing path for a Trump-Biden rematch. Kremlin says Russia will not interfere in the US presidential elections. And UK economy forecast to grow by 0.8% this year after entering recession in 2023, says Finance Minister Jeremy Hunt in his spring budget, announces new cuts to national insurance contributions by 2 percentage points. Up first, news from Asia. External Affairs Minister Dr. S. Jaishankar on Wednesday called for expanding cooperation in areas of critical and emerging technologies for a safe and secure Indo-Pacific at the 10th India-Korea Joint Commission meeting held in Seoul. The minister next heads to Japan for a 2-day visit. Here's more.
External Affairs Minister Dr. S. Jaishankar on Wednesday co-chaired the 10th India-South Korea Joint Commission meeting in Seoul with his Korean counterpart Cho Tae-yul. Dr. Jaishankar termed the meeting as comprehensive and productive. The conversation covered the expanded bilateral ties, cooperation in the field of defense, science and technology, business and trade, people-to-people exchange and cultural cooperation. Both ministers also exchanged views on the developments in the Indo-Pacific, the convergences to challenges in the region, and regional and global issues of mutual interest. In his opening remarks, the External Affairs Minister called for deepening cooperation in the Indo-Pacific.
And our bilateral exchanges, trade, investments, defense and S&T cooperation have all seen a steady growth. While keeping up the momentum in the traditional areas of cooperation, we would be very much interested now in expanding it to new areas such as critical and emerging technologies, semiconductors, green hydrogen, human resource mobility, nuclear cooperation, supply chain resilience, etc., to make our ties more contemporary. Your focus on the Indo-Pacific region is a good case to point, and we both have stakes in its stability, security and prosperity.
Later, the External Affairs Minister met Gimhae City Mayor Hong Tae-yong. He said the Gimhae Ayodhya Connect is a testament to the shared cultural heritage and long-standing people-to-people relations. They also discussed greater cultural and educational cooperation with Gimhae City. Before wrapping up his visit, the External Affairs Minister interacted with representatives of the Indian Chamber of Commerce in Korea and urged them to further strengthen the business bridge between India and South Korea. Later in the evening, the External Affairs Minister left for Japan on a 2-day visit, where he has a power-packed schedule.
This is a talk or a meeting to promote, back channels or what is called Track 2 dialogue between the two countries. It will be attended by the minister, but also by think tanks, lobbyists and academics here in Japan. And it's going to be largely focused on the Quad partnership that these two countries share with Australia and the US, but also other geoeconomic and geopolitical issues as well. That is going to be continuing into Thursday. There also to look forward to is the 10th dialogue between Minister Jaishankar and his counterpart here in Tokyo, Yoko Kamikawa.
The EM will conclude his Japan visit on the 8th of March and return back to India. With Chris Gilbert in Tokyo, Raghav Kumar Jha, DD India.
Australia and the Southeast Asian nations bloc ASEAN have called for restraint in the contested South China Sea. In a joint statement, the bloc has asked for rules-based order in the Indo-Pacific as Beijing looks to increase its presence in the South China Sea. Australia hosted an ASEAN summit in Melbourne to mark the 50th anniversary of its ties with the bloc. The summit concludes today.
I am very concerned, and Australia is concerned, about any unsafe and destabilising behaviour in the South China Sea. It is dangerous and it creates risks of miscalculation, which can then lead to escalation. So we would call upon a number of nations, emphasised in their statements. The foundation document is UNCLOS, the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea. That is something that should be the guide for all nations' participation.
China was quick to react to this, claiming that the situation in South China Sea was generally stable and Beijing's position on the disputed area was consistent and clear.
The current situation in the South China Sea is generally stable, and the China's position on the South China Sea issue is consistent and very clear. We will remain committed to properly managing differences with the countries concerned through dialogue and consultation, working with Asian countries to fully and effectively implement the declaration of the conduct of parties in the South China Sea, and actively advancing the consultation on a code of conduct in the South China Sea, while jointly safeguarding the peace and stability of the South China Sea.
On to the US now. The Super Tuesday contests saw Joe Biden winning in 14 states while Donald Trump coming out victorious in 12. Nikki Haley scored a surprise with a win in Vermont, but in the latest, Nikki Haley is set to end her presidential campaign, clearing way for a rematch between Donald Trump and Joe Biden in the November US presidential elections. My colleague Nick Harper is in Washington, D.C. He gives us more on this and other stories making headlines across the world. Nick, Haley out of the presidential race.
Well, Tanvi, it certainly looks like it. We'll know for sure, though, when she speaks in her home state of South Carolina in just under an hour's time. So after Super Tuesday, the stage is now set for another contest between US President Joe Biden and former President Donald Trump for the US presidential election that'll be held in November. Republican candidate Nikki Haley is expected to suspend her bid for the White House. Well, let's go over to Benji Hire, who's joining us live from Washington for the latest on this. Benji, what are you hearing about Haley's plans to drop out?
Nick, we're sitting here in Washington, D.C., and that's significant because this is the only state/territory/district in the United States besides Vermont that Nikki Haley was actually able to win as part of the primary contest to try to take the nomination and be the candidate to face off against Joe Biden for the presidency in the November 2024 election. Ultimately, Trump's wins in other states, especially on Super Tuesday, when about 15 states were on the ballot, millions of voters going to the polls, those victories make him almost mathematically certain to become the nominee again, and clears the path for the former president, who's vying for the Oval Office for the third time, to be the Republican Party's nominee. It is under those circumstances that Nikki Haley finds herself in a situation where simply the deficit to Donald Trump is insurmountable in terms of delegates, in terms of fundraising, in terms of support amongst the Republican base, and therefore it's inevitable that, as you say, we'll hear very shortly her announcement in South Carolina that she will be stepping aside. The reality that she will have to admit when she does take to the stage is that she didn't garner enough support for her and just couldn't convince voters, despite all the baggage that comes with the former president, to dump Donald Trump.
And Benji, of course, a lot of people will be listening into that speech. One of them will be the former president, Donald Trump himself. Are we expecting Haley to go ahead and endorse her rival?
It is normal procedure, actually, Nick, that people who drop out of the Republican Party's nomination contest, or even the Democrats, tend to fall behind the prospective nominee. That is unlikely to happen this time, at least not today. We have word from the Haley campaign that she will call on Donald Trump to earn the support of Republicans and independent voters who backed her, but will not endorse former President Trump on Wednesday. It is interesting to see what Nikki Haley will do next. She's not primed to be a vice presidential candidate, having been so critical of Donald Trump during the campaign. She condemned, for example, what she calls the chaos that followed Trump, called for a new generation of leaders for the country to move on beyond both him and President Biden, and consistently pointed to polling which showed that she was the best contender to take on Joe Biden in the general election ahead of Donald Trump. Perhaps no surprising, given that Mr. Trump is the one who faces 91 charges, multiple criminal trials that he may face over the coming year. Interestingly, those have not impeded his momentum amongst his base. In fact, if anything, Nick, they've encouraged them as he continues to brand his prosecution as political persecution amongst his opponents. We also saw Joe Biden sweep to victory in multiple states in the Democrat primary, and so a rematch between him and Donald Trump is now very much on the cards, and that campaign is seemingly already underway.
It is indeed, Benji. Thank you very much. That was Benji Hire joining us live from Washington, D.C. Well, moving on, the Kremlin has said that Russia will not interfere in the US presidential election, and it's dismissed American findings that Moscow orchestrated campaigns to sway both the 2016 and 2020 elections here in the United States. The Kremlin spokesperson said the United States was fighting against Russia in Ukraine.
Your
Attorney General's office has concluded that there was no Russian interference in the United States. And the Parliamentary Commission has reached the same conclusion. We didn't say this. Your politicians did. Spending your money on an investigation that nobody understands. But that is how it was. And this time we do not intend to interfere. I just said that we never dictate to anyone how to live. But we don't want you to dictate to us.
Delegations have continued in the Middle East to try and arrange ceasefire talks. They've now entered their third day, but we have still not seen a breakthrough between Hamas and mediators in Cairo. US President Joe Biden said it was now in the hands of Hamas whether to accept a deal for a ceasefire in the Gaza Strip in exchange for political prisoners being held by Israel. Negotiators in Cairo are trying to secure a 40-day ceasefire. US National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan and Qatar's Prime Minister Sheikh Mohammed bin Abdulrahman Al Thani discussed a potential ceasefire, along with the release of hostages held in Gaza on Tuesday. They both stressed that the deal will focus on the release of the sick, the wounded, the elderly and female hostages, and the two men agreed to stay in regular contact as negotiations continue. France has become the latest country to airdrop aid over the Gaza Strip, taking place earlier on Tuesday. As the conflict wears on, food supplies and other aid has become scarce in the enclave, leaving nations to parachute humanitarian supplies in. Earlier, the US and Belgium airdropped aid to help civilians. Russian President Vladimir Putin's foreign intelligence chief has said that French President Emmanuel Macron's refusal to rule out sending European troops to fight Russian soldiers in Ukraine was extremely dangerous and irresponsible. Asked about Macron's remarks, Sergei Naryshkin, the head of Russia's Foreign Intelligence Service, heavily criticized the remarks. Macron said last month that there was no consensus on sending European troops to fight in Ukraine, but that nothing should be excluded. The United States and other European members of the NATO alliance have said there are no plans to put boots on the ground in Ukraine. Meanwhile, Russia has dismissed arrest warrants issued by the International Criminal Court for two Russian commanders suspected of war crimes in Ukraine. On Tuesday, the ICC issued arrest warrants for top Russian commanders Sergei Kobylash and Viktor Sokolov for missile strikes against Ukrainian electricity infrastructure. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said that as Russia was not a party to the Rome Statute, that's the ICC's founding treaty, Moscow did not recognise the warrants. In March last year, the ICC also issued a warrant for the arrest of President Vladimir Putin and Russian Children's Commissioner Maria Lvova-Belova as war crimes charges related to the abduction to Ukrainian children. That time, as well, the Kremlin dismissed those warrants, calling them outrageous and unacceptable. Well, that's it from me here in Washington. Tambi, throwing it back to you in the studio.
Thank you very much, Nick, for all those updates. Nick Harper joining us all from Washington, D.C. Next, onto the German military audio leak. Germany's Defense Minister Boris Pistorius said on Tuesday that one participant on a high-level military call on Ukraine intercepted by Russia had mistakenly joined via a non-secure line and German communication systems had not been compromised. Asked if the leak could affect the position of Gerhards, who was not the one to dial in from Singapore, Pistorius said he was not going to sacrifice one of his best officers to what he called Putin's games. The German government further accused Russian President Vladimir Putin of seeking to sow disunity and create divisions within Germany. The leak has nonetheless embarrassed Germany and prompted questions about its intelligence security. And to understand the fallout of this leak, we spoke to DW's Michella Kufner from Berlin a little while ago.
The German Chancellor Olaf Scholz let it slip, to say the very least, that there most likely are French and British troops on the ground in Ukraine to control the targeting of some of their own weapon systems. And Germany, or the German Chancellor, used this as an argument why he's not sending the Taurus weapon, which is seen as the most precise weapon. He also later mentioned that it could be used to strike Moscow. So this is also a question of trust towards Ukraine, using weapons only the way they are being.
All right, UK's Finance Minister Jeremy Hunt is announcing his spring budget, possibly the final fiscal event before what promises to be a challenging general election for the ruling Conservative Party. Jeremy Hunt, in his speech, said that he would cut the rate of social security contributions paid by millions of workers for a second time in under 4 months before a national election expected later this year. He added that the government would reduce national insurance contributions by 2 percentage points for the employees and the self-employed. Hunt said a system which allows UK residents, including foreign nationals, to avoid tax on their overseas income would be scrapped. A policy, he said, would raise £2.7 billion a year. So-called non-domiciled status in Britain had been available to people who live in Britain but do not regard it as their permanent home, allowed them to opt to pay UK tax only on income earned in or transferred to Britain. And DD India's Ollie Barrett is tracking these updates from Westminster, London for us. Ollie, what have been the key announcements made at the budget so far?
One of the key headline announcements that was made by Chancellor Jeremy Hunt was that which was widely trailed, which was a 2p cut in the rate of national insurance, which is effectively one of the individual rates of income tax paid here in the UK, although it's not the overall income tax rate, which was left unchanged. And that, as I say, was widely trailed ahead of the budget speech, but was confirmed by Finance Minister Jeremy Hunt on his feet in the House of Commons behind me. There were a few other measures as well, some extra taxation on business class flights, for example, an extension of a windfall profits tax on oil and gas giants. That's being pushed back towards the end of 2029 because the government says that actually there have been higher prices for longer in that sector due to the crisis in Ukraine than were expected, and therefore more windfall profits have been made and will be made over the next couple of years. So those are some of the key measures. There have been changes as well on other items when it comes to spending and taxation, and the UK Finance Minister Jeremy Hunt insisting that when it comes to public services that he's going to be able to launch a campaign to make them more efficient and more productive in the years ahead. We've already had the response from the opposition Labour Party leader Keir Starmer in the House of Commons. He says this is a desperate last act for the Conservative Party, and he insists that the party has presided over 14 years of what he describes as economic failure.
All right, we leave it here. Thank you very much, Ollie. Ollie Barrett reporting to us from London. Moving on back to Asia. In a major boost for the Indian Navy and India's security infrastructure, the naval detachment Mini Koi was commissioned as INS Jatayu on Wednesday. The new full-fledged naval base was commissioned by Navy Chief Admiral R. Hari Kumar at Mini Koi in Lakshadweep Islands. The Navy will now deploy some of its assets in the Mini Koi Island and will also base personnel there permanently. This was not the case earlier. The event marks an important milestone in the Navy's resolve to incrementally augment security infrastructure at the strategically important Lakshadweep Islands. INS Jatayu is the second naval base in Lakshadweep after INS Dweep Rakshak in Kavaratti. Mini Koi is the southernmost island of Lakshadweep, 215 nautical miles southwest of Kochi. So a new base for the Indian Navy at the southwesternmost part of the southwestern country is set to become a force multiplier. The base, commissioned as INS Jatayu, is located on Mini Koi Island of Lakshadweep. The Indian Navy chief called it a historic moment for India.
We are right now on the decks of INS Vikrant, one of the largest ships of the Indian Navy and the biggest example of Make in India initiative and the success of India in this front. And with us we have Chief of the Naval Staff, Admiral R. Hari Kumar with us. Sir, it's a privilege to talk to you here on the deck of INS Vikrant. Make in India has become reality now. But as we talk about Make in India, before that we would like to talk about the biggest news of the day. INS Jatayu has been commissioned at the southernmost island of the Western Front. Sir, what is the relevance of the base? What would you like to talk about?
This is the southernmost island, extent of our land territory on the west coast of the west coast. So we have had a naval presence there in terms of detachment for quite some time. But we felt that this is now the time has come to commission it as a unit, so that we can further the development of capability in the islands. We have to have better surveillance. We have to have a response capability. We need to know what is happening in this area, who is operating, why they are operating, etc. So by commissioning this unit there, it will increase our capability as well as provide capacity for undertaking various tasks.
Camera person Vishwabandhu Goel, Namakshi Dongre, DD India.
India got its first underwater metro rail service in the coastal city of Kolkata on Wednesday. India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi inaugurated the new metro line called the Havra Maidan Esplanade section. It passes beneath the river Hooghly, which separates Kolkata and Havra cities on its east and west banks. Staying in Asia, Pakistan's Supreme Court ruled on Wednesday that former Prime Minister Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, who was hanged 44 years ago after being convicted of murder, did not get a fair trial. Bhutto, the founder of the Pakistan People's Party, now run by his grandson, and former Foreign Minister Bilawal Bhutto Zardaris, was hanged in 1979 after a trial under the military regime of late General Zia-ul Haq. And next we take a look at other stories making news around the world. In Thailand, huge number of people assembled at the gate of Hor Kum Luang in Chiang Mai city to pay obeisance to the holy relics of Lord Buddha and his foremost disciples. These relics were sent by the government of India. This sacred journey will culminate on March the 19th, with the relics being escorted back to their respective homes in India. A painter who had lost both hands will now be able to paint again with his new hands, thanks to Indian doctors who successfully performed the bilateral transplantation here in New Delhi. Doctors from Delhi's Sir Gangaram Hospital performed the surgery using hands of a woman declared to be brain dead. She had donated her organs. A colourful scroll by Ito Jakuchu, a renowned Japanese painter from the 18th century, has been discovered in Europe and is now housed at a Kyoto museum in Japan. Jakuchu was active in Kyoto during the middle of the Edo period, which lasted from the 17th to the 19th centuries. The scroll is over 3.3 meters long. And the world's largest wooden wind turbine tower was inaugurated in southwestern Sweden on Monday. Built by a Swedish company, the total height of the turbine is 150 meters. According to the company, switching to a wooden tower benefits in reduced carbon emissions during manufacturing, while the material itself stores carbon. So that's it in this edition of DD India Global. Do let us know your thoughts on the news of the day. Connect with us on Facebook, X, formerly Twitter and Instagram. You can also find us online at ddindia.co.in. I'm Tanvi Taneja from my entire team in New Delhi. Thank you for watching. Namaskar.